Hi students, welcome back to my channel Evolve Solving Physics. Today we are going to discuss about a new topic, that is types of vectors. In previous class we have discussed about scalars and vectors. What is meant by scalar, what is meant by vector, that we have discussed in previous class. Today we are going to discuss about types of vectors. As we discussed that, so which has only magnitude means that we call it as scalar. The substance both having magnitude and direction and should obey law of vector addition, that we call it as vector. How we can represent that vector? So we can identify vector as it should contain magnitude and direction and it should follow the law of vector addition. But how we represent a vector? So we represent a vector as, so this is a magnitude. I said that magnitude means line or length. Length represent magnitude. So this is magnitude and direction represents arrow mark. Arrow. So this is the symbol for a vector. So this line represents length, that is magnitude, and this arrow represents direction. So, and how we denote this vector means, for suppose vector can be denoted as a alphabet should contain a magnitude with arrow mark. This is represented as vector. How we can represent a scalar means, scalar can be represented by only alphabets A, C, P, Q. These are all scalars. Vectors are represented by a line with an arrow. So this is how we represent a vector. Here I said the line represents magnitude and arrow represents direction. Here these we call it as tail. This we call it as tail. This point we call it as tail and this point we call it as tip. So the arrow mark side represents tip and the back side represents tail. So you should remember that. So for suppose O, P. The point O represents tail and the point P represents tip. So this is one of the important point. You should remember that the arrow mark side represents tip and the back side represents tail. Now we are going to discuss about types of vectors. So equality vectors. Equality vectors or equal vectors. We call it as equal vectors or equality of vectors. So how we can find the given vectors are equal vectors or equality vectors? So two vectors are said to be equal if and only if they represent same physical quantity with same magnitude and same direction. So for suppose if we taken and two vectors, the two vectors should have same physical quantity and they should have same magnitude and same direction. That vectors we call it as equality vectors or equal vectors. So I am considering two vectors, A bar and B bar are two vectors. So these two vectors should have same physical quantities. They should not have different physical quantities. They should have both vectors should have same physical quantities and they should have same magnitude and directions. Same directions. For suppose A is moving like this, A vector. This is B vector. So these two having same physical quantities, you can see that this is the magnitude. I said that the line represents magnitude and arrow mark represents direction. So they are starting from same point and moving in same direction. So these can be said as equality vectors. So these vectors are equal vectors. So you can observe here that when magnitudes are equal means the two vectors will be parallel to each other. So when two vectors are parallel to each other means their magnitudes are same. How we can find these two vectors are parallel? So if we move the second vector tail, that is P, towards O, then Q dash tip towards Q, they both will coincide. So these two vectors can be called it as equal vectors or equality vectors. For suppose this is A vector, this is B vector, consider it as OP Q dash. So if we move the tail of B vector towards O and tip of Q dash towards Q, they will coincide. They are parallel. When they coincide with their tips and tails, then that vectors we call it as equal vectors. For suppose this is A vector and this is B vector. If we move the tail of B towards A, OP will coincide, but Q dash does not coincide because they are not parallel to each other. So when the tips and tails of two vectors will coincide, when they are parallel, then we can call it as equal vectors. When one of the tails is coincide and tips are not coincide means they are not parallel to each other, the two given vectors are not equal vectors. So when any number of vectors which are parallel to each other means that vectors we call it as equal vectors. So this is the simple trick. The given vectors are equal or not. So you should check as whether the tails and tips are coincides or not. If they coincide with each other means then we call it as equal vectors. Means they having same magnitude. As you can observe, here this is not a equal vector. Why? Because their directions are same but magnitudes are different. They are not parallel to each other. So this is not an equal vector. So equal vectors means two vectors should have same physical quantity and should have same magnitude and same direction. If any one of that is missing means we won't call it as equal vectors, that are unequal vectors. So another type of vectors are like vectors or parallel vectors. So two or more vectors representing same physical quantity are called like vectors if they are parallel to each other. However, their magnitudes may be different but with same direction. So what they are saying means if we consider three vectors or two vectors, they should have same physical quantity, means same velocity, same acceleration, means these three vectors are moving with same physical quantity, means acceleration, moving. So these three vectors should be parallel to each other and their direction should be same, but they may be different magnitudes. You can see that the three magnitudes are different but directions are same and moving parallel to each other. So when we call it as unlike vectors means moving opposite direction to each other. So vectors are moving opposite direction to each other and the magnitudes may be different. So main magnitudes may also be different and direction should also be different, that we call it as unlike vectors. Here the direction should be same and magnitude can be different here and should parallel to each other. Here the magnitude can be different and direction should be opposite in direction and magnitude may be different. magnitude means length. These we call it as magnitude, length. So these may be different and should move in opposite direction to each other. That we call it as unlike vectors. So different magnitudes, maybe different magnitudes, same direction, parallel and should be parallel to each other. That we call it as like vectors. So what is difference between equal vectors and like vectors? In equal vectors, they should contain same magnitude, same direction and parallel to each other. But here in like vectors, they may be different magnitudes but same direction and parallel to each other. That we call it as like vectors. So next vector is negative vector. What is meant by negative vector means a vector having same magnitude and opposite in direction to that of given vector is called negative vector. So we are giving a vector a bar is moving in forward direction, but this vector is not moving in forward direction as we are said to move in forward direction, but it is moving in opposite direction, that is backward direction. That we call it as negative vector. So for a given vector, it is moving in opposite direction. So negative vector is denoted by minus a bar. So we are giving a bar as forward direction, but that vector is moving in opposite direction to that given vector. That we call it as negative vector. So vector having same magnitude and opposite in direction to that of given vector. For a given vector, the vector is moving in opposite direction. That is called negative vector, but having same magnitude. So vector should have same magnitude, but it is moving opposite to that of given vector. So we call it as negative vector. Next vector is co-initial vectors. What is meant by co-initial vectors? If we take a number of vectors, they should move from same point, same initial point. So these are the three vectors which is starting from same initial point, should have same initial point. Same initial point means same starting point. That vectors we call it as co-initial vectors. Co-initial vectors means the vector should have same initial point. That we call it as co-initial vectors. So the vectors having same initial point. Initial point means starting point. Starting point should be same. They can move in different directions, but the starting point of these vectors should be same. That we call it as co-initial vector. Is called co-initial vector. So that vectors is called co-initial vectors. Next, collinear vectors. Two or more vectors are said to be collinear vectors when they act along the same line. However, their magnitudes and directions may be different. So here you can see that they are moving in same line, but they having directions moving in forward direction, same direction, and you can observe somewhat they are moving with same or different magnitudes, but they are moving in same line. So here you can observe that different directions, different magnitudes, but they are moving in same line. So these we call it as co-linear vectors. So any number of vectors should move in same line. They may have same magnitude or same direction, but they should move in a same line. That we call it as collinear vectors. These are some of the types of vectors. There are some more important types of vectors we are going to discuss in next video. So if you have any doubts, please comment me in comment box. Please like, share and subscribe my channel. Thank you.